And then one day I finally get this strange email from this guy saying, well, he's an insider at this company called Shein. And, there is something terribly wrong going on there.
Follow the money.
Hello and welcome to the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. In each edition, we dive into a recent investigation exposing Europe's power brokers, from corrupt politicians and shady lobbyists to mysterious oligarchs and financial fraudsters. I'm your host, Emma Duchesnier, recording here from Brussels, and I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
In today's episode, we're diving into the story of a company that has in many ways transformed the global fashion scene, Shein. Alex, are you a big shopper?
Well, I love online shopping. I'm a kind of a tall guy. So, the stuff I need, the L t-shirts, but they're extra long, you just don't find it in a regular shop. So I go to specialized shops for tall people. I also obviously mail order online my size 47 shoes because you just, you'll not get them off the shelf in any shop. So sure, yeah, big online shopper, yeah.
Where do you buy them from? Or is that too much of a private question?
Well, I buy here and there. I like to be a bit promiscuous with my shopping, but in the end, you always come back to the places that are cheapest. And, the other day I had to fix a doorknob in my apartment and it needed a particular kind of screw, which I didn't know what the exact size was. So I went to comparison website and I found out that Temu, Chinese online shop, is just the cheapest place to buy these type of screws, like by 10, 20 euros difference. So obviously I went there and I had it sent from Temu.
In today's episode, we're talking about a company maybe somewhat similar to the one you just mentioned, Shein. Alex, you investigate this fashion giant together with Yara van Heugten, who has become our go-to expert at cutting through the smoke and mirrors behind the flashy claims retail moguls love to make. Welcome, Yara.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How did you guys start investigating this company and what sparked your interest about it?
For me, it's basically just started on Instagram. I was just scrolling to my timeline and I kept on seeing this new company that I haven't heard of many times. So I was targeted by ads. I saw it on so many of the influencers that I was following, wearing it. So many of people I knew were starting to basically do these Shein hauls where they bought like big boxes of all the Shein clothes and showing them off on their Instagram pages. So there was suddenly this new company that everyone seemed to be wearing. And I was already like quite curious about, okay, where does this company come from? Where did the clothes come from? How do they make them? Like all of these questions. And then at one point in time, there was this kind of, there was this thing online where Shein invited a bunch of influencers to see like the working conditions in their factory in China. And this became kind of a strange thing on the internet because they invited a bunch of American influencers to see like this very shiny production location in China. And one of the influencers afterwards recorded a video saying something like, I'm an investigative journalist and I can tell you now there's nothing wrong with these working conditions. And I was seeing this and I was like, I'm not sure if I believe this story. So that was really the beginning for me where I wanted to know everything about this company. Who is the owner? What are the real working conditions like? Where did they take these influencers? So that was it was just so much interest and curiosity from my side. That's where it really started for me. So then I wrote a first story basically summarizing everything I could find about this company. A while after that, I started working with Alex on it as well.
So in many ways, you were actually influenced by Shein, but maybe not in the way that they really wanted you to be influenced.
I guess this was not their intention, no.
And wow, by an investigative journalist even.
Well, she said she was an investigative journalist, but obviously she wasn't. She was really more of an influencer. Afterwards, she also apologized. Like her followers, a lot of them were really mad about the things she said. And so she had to apologize. And afterwards, she also like cut ties with Shein because so many people were mad at her for basically supporting this company without really knowing what she was talking about. But yeah, she also just basically framed herself as an investigative journalist while I don't think she really was.
I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a Follow the Money story being concluded by, oh, there's nothing wrong here. Doesn't really sound very investigative journalism.
No, I guess not.
And so how did you guys end up writing this story together? How did this collaboration come about?
So Yara had already published about Shein, and then I usually work on tech policy, tech regulation stuff. And then one day I get this strange email from this guy saying, well, he's an insider at this company called Shein, and, there is something terribly wrong going on there. And I immediately kind of thought, okay, this is something that somebody in our team, in our organization has already looked into. And I got in touch with Yara and forwarded her the email. And then we started kind of a dialogue, a conversation with that source. And I don't know, Yara, about your recollection of this, but this is when it started to get really interesting. It was a series of, first a phone call, a text message, then it became eventually we had a video call. This person started sending us documents that purported to be internal Shein documents. And what the documents purportedly showed was that Shein was using design features that were meant to misdirect young users, kind of prompt them to buying ever more, gamifying the app to make it, appealing in a way for teenagers to keep adding new stuff to their, to their shopping carts by, telling them, okay, if you do this and if you do this, then you will get a bonus or free gifts. And we kept looking into it. And in a sense, what that person was telling us seemed to be true on the face of it. Both the stuff we saw in the app. Also, we started checking out some of the internal info he gave us. And at least at the beginning, it all seemed to match up. And we were incredibly intrigued. And Yara, do you remember we had a video meeting with him? And he claimed he was in Paris. And we got a blurry image of a guy. Yeah. What do you remember about that video meeting?
In that video meeting, it started to be like a bit, we were unsure at that time, I think, a bit about him. He was in Paris. He seemed like very shy. My recollection is that after the call, I thought, I think there's just a little bit of a cultural difference here. That was my feeling at that time, that I was like, maybe he's a bit afraid to do this. Maybe he didn't expect, like, after sending that first email, that we would check so many things. So it still felt like everything was matching up. And the things he said actually matched with what we saw in the app and what we knew about the company. But yeah, we were also not 100% sure at that time.
Yeah. We ended up trying to verify as many details about that person, but also about the documents that, these alleged internal documents. And the more we checked them out, the less sense it made, the more kind of discrepancies showed up, or they were, one of the documents named the person at Shein who, we initially thought, okay, that's a working email address. That person probably exists. But then looking into it more closely, we couldn't find any trace of that person. So wondering, is that real? Is that real? And I think that question became more and more pressing the more we looked into it. But then I think that then there was a plot twist in a sense, because we didn't stop there. We realized that despite, potentially having been misled by the source, the stuff he pointed out in the app that we could see was true. Fun fact, by the way, the source disappeared on us sometime during the process. So that person, the number was suddenly disconnected. He disappeared from WhatsApp, didn't reply to our emails anymore. So that was kind of another red flag eventually.
Yeah, big red flag. Yeah.
And was there any moment where you were like, this document, this person, they don't seem reliable. Let's quit the story here. Let's end it.
Well, we discussed it many times because it started with this source. And once you don't know exactly if he's telling the truth, you also don't want to be played. You don't want to be writing a story that someone else wants you to write based on something that you cannot verify. So at one point, we decided, okay, let's just ask Shein about this document, and hopefully in their reply, they will verify that they created this document. But the opposite happened. They actually said, well, we have to investigate, but we cannot find where it was created internally. The document was telling that the design was made to mislead consumers deliberately. That was the part that we couldn't couldn't really prove anymore. But still, we could see that they were misleading consumers.
We realized that despite, potentially having been misled by the source, the stuff he pointed out in the app that we could see was true. So there were patterns in the app that were gamified, potentially quite addictive to teenagers. There's really an issue there. And so in the end, we ended up ditching the source, but keeping with the story. And I think that was a very good decision. In a sense, you can debate the question of intentionality, but in the end, it's not like you just kind of make an accident with your mouse and suddenly you have a feature that promises free gifts if you do, go through a gamified experience where you keep clicking for 24 hours until you get a reward. In a sense, like there's no question that was intentional and that, we're not misreading what it is. I guess the real question that is now still being pursued by consumer groups, but also as part of an investigation by the European Commission under the Digital Services Act, is the question is that actually illegal under the law? And if so, will there be consequences? And I think, what we were first reporting on all these months ago has now become a pressing concern for regulators all over Europe. I think that's quite interesting.
But the actual answer to that question, whether it's illegal or not, that's yet to be given. Am I correct?
Exactly. So, I mean, we're not prosecutors. We're not courts. It is for the regulators to decide whether it's legal or not. I think what we flagged in our story is how potentially misleading these kind of patterns are.
And maybe just a very basic overview. What are these dark patterns that Shein is using?
So in the legal definition, as it is used, for instance, in the Digital Services Act, talk about a dark pattern when the design intentionally steers users of an app or an interface in a direction that the user wouldn't otherwise take. It's like the designer clearly wants you to choose one option and makes it so that you choose that option. And I think what we are seeing within the Shein app is also there are elements of it where you feel the app is compelling you to do something rather than another thing. And the question is it deceptive? Is that a dark pattern in the sense of the law?
Before we dive further into the mode of operation of this company, you came into the story with two very different expertises, different backgrounds. How did those two different expertises work out in the story? How did your guys' collaboration go?
I think that was actually really nice to have Alex being like an expert in the Digital Services Act, knowing everything about Brussels, while I'm focusing much more on environmental human rights. So it was really nice to be able to build on Alex's expertise in like the EU regulations that were connected to this story. Yeah.
It's quite clear that I could never have done a story involving the fashion industry because it's something I know absolutely nothing about without working with Yara. So I was very glad about that. I think I was able to contribute a little bit on the kind of techie, appy side of things and the regulatory angle, but the core of the expertise is really something that Yara contributed. And I was very happy to work with her on that.
Thanks.
And yeah, with your expertise on the fashion industry, I think a very basic question that a lot of shoppers wonder: how is it possible that this company is able to offer products at such significantly lower prices than traditional fast fashion stores like H&M or Zara?
I think there's actually many reasons for this. Maybe to mention a few numbers, Shein products, they usually start around even like €2, €5 per item, while H&M is more like starting from 15 to 20 euros and Zara starts from 25 to 30 euros. So there is actually a big gap in the price, and the price from Shein are just so low that it's a really good question where that comes from. The one argument Shein keeps repeating there all the time is that they are a very innovative company. They have designed a on-demand production model, which basically means that they have a very small batch production. So while, for example, Zara designs a new collection, then has it produced, like they estimate how many items get sold. They produce this whole batch of products, get them sent to warehouses in Europe, and from their warehouses, they go to the stores and then they are sold. Shein operates very differently. So Shein designs a new product, directly puts it online, and then produces on the go. So when I am buying a product as a consumer, there goes like a signal to one of their production partners. Hey, we need like 5 extra items of this product. So that's their production model, which is very different from the production models of their competitors. They say this is a very important aspect of their pricing. And they say this is true because this production model means that they don't have excess inventory. With Zara, for example, at the end of the season, some of the products are not sold. And so they don't earn on these specific products while they have made costs to actually produce them. So this is one point that Shein always stresses. We don't have excess inventory. So that is why our prices are so low. There's also the fact that they don't have physical stores, that they have very limited physical warehouses. So this is also much cheaper if you don't have all the personnel in the big stores in the shopping street. That just reduces your cost. They have a different advertising model. They rely on micro influencers a lot, which they can just pay with sending out free stuff, while H&M and Zara traditionally used more like traditional advertising, working with bigger influencers, which you have to pay for their work. So there's a difference. And the final thing that I'll mention is that they have a big advantage in something that's called the de minimis tariff loophole. So this is something that basically means that because they send their products directly to consumers in Europe and the US, the packages they send over, they fall below a certain threshold and they don't have to pay import tariffs on these products. And there's many experts that actually say that this difference, that they don't have to pay imports taxes for sending their products to Europe and the US, is actually a very important reason for their low pricing.
The last point that you mentioned, that might be about to change. Am I correct, Alex?
So the European Commission has been making noises about changing the kind of inflow of cheap parcels from outside of Europe, and especially kind of changing somehow the custom structure so that you can no longer have basically free imports without any import duty. Now, the latest proposal was the EU Commission was suggesting to impose a €2 per item tax on packages entering Europe from outside, mainly from China. So that would mean that, for instance, like you buy one of these €3 t-shirts, you have €2 in tax added onto it. And that will obviously make it a lot more expensive for customers to buy from Shein, also from Temu, from AliExpress, other kind of Chinese retailers. And that is obviously meant as a way to deter cheap imports from outside. This is a long way from being agreed upon. Tax matters usually need buy-in from all the EU members. So we're still at the beginning of the process, but I think it's plausible to see within a year or two this kind of minimum levy, which will probably minimize the appetite for large scale bulk purchases of clothes.
But we're slow, right, Alex? Compared to the US, Trump has already done it.
Exactly. I mean, the European Union is not known for speedy rulemaking. Everything takes a year, and anything more takes a year extra. But I think we're now at the point where a lot of member states in the European Union, notably Germany, but also other countries, were putting pressure on Europe, saying, well, this is bad for high street retailers. This is bad for the environment. There's concerns from unions about labor issues in China and so forth. So this is really cumulative pressure that has now built up for the European Union to act, to do something about kind of the challenge posed by Chinese retailers in Europe. So I think this might not be the last proposal out of Brussels on this issue.
And because just to add some context to this issue, it's huge. I think most of these little packages from China, and it's not just Shein, it's other web shops too, Temu, AliExpress, but also some smaller ones. And most of those packages arrive in the Netherlands. From there, they're redistributed to other countries in the EU. And in the Netherlands alone, it's 1.7 million packages a day. So it's also just, very much of a practical problem, I think, where just customs cannot handle it. What you touched upon is that in the US, something already changed. What was the effect of those changes?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So on May 2nd, the US tariff exemption closed, and the exemption there was actually much bigger than the exemption in the EU. So we had a threshold of 150 euros. In the US, there was a threshold of $800. So there was a lot more packages actually exempt from paying import duties. On May 2nd, it closed, and it was really interesting that we have already been seeing some changes after that. So, for example, Temu announced that it would actually stop shipping low-cost items from China altogether. So they now plan to work with US local sellers only on their platform. So they don't intend to work with Chinese sellers anymore in the US. And Bloomberg calculated that prices on the Shein platform have already increased. So, for example, in the beauty and health category, prices on Shein increased by 51% in 1 week. A 10-piece set of kitchen towel increased in price by 377%. And the average increase for women's clothing was 8%. So that was a bit less. I think that's the most important category still. But that actually shows that what we were talking about earlier, that the business model of Shein that they have was actually relying for a big part on this tariff exemption, and that they need to raise prices now that they don't have this exemption anymore.
And yet what I read in your article is that Shein actually said that they're endorsing EU custom reforms.
What I always have been hearing Shein say is that the business model was not relying on this tax exemption. Yeah, they were very loud on saying that this wouldn't be such an issue for them. I think one of the reasons why they wanted to say this is that they were already dropping in valuation. So there were big concerns from investors regarding this tariff overhaul. And a few years back, I think Shein had an initial valuation of 100 billion when they had their first funding round. This already dropped to like 60 billion, 50 billion when they were talking about going to the stock market in London. At one point, they had like expected valuation of 50 billion pounds. And now I recently read that already was halved again. So they have been dropping from a valuation of 100 billion to 50, then 25. Yeah. And I think there were big concerns within like the company when they saw this valuation drop. So they needed to assure investors that this wasn't a crucial part of their business model. So my assumption is that is why they kept saying this was actually not an issue for them. At the same time, I know in September last year, they commissioned a report from a consultancy firm, Copenhagen Economics. They commissioned a report basically investing this tariff overhaul, and this report was very negative on the on this tariff overhaul. It came with arguments that would be bad for the economy, it would be bad for consumers. So they had this like classic, they used the classic trick, not being very positive themselves and then commissioning someone else to be actually very negative about it.
Sounds very convenient for them to have an external consultancy company saying that it's not a good idea.
Would also just like to add that, you know, that the regulatory headache for Shein is not soon end, because on top of other issues, there's been joint complaint by consumer groups that will, you know, be now investigated by consumer authorities about some of the issues we already mentioned. Then there is still, Shein has been designated a very large online platform under the Digital Services Act, which means that it falls under more stringent rules. The Commission has kind of a quite sharp sword in that it can levy quite high fines, up to 6% of global annual turnover on companies under that law if the company fails to comply. And the Commission has sent so far 2 formal requests for information to Shein on certain aspects of its business, covering issues around possible dark patterns, but also kind of the way its recommender algorithms are structured, how it ensures protection of users' health and well-being. And so these issues are still being looked into by the Commission. It has not yet opened a formal investigation, but that is a possibility in the next months. Should the Commission decide to use its enforcement powers under the DSA, that could become a quite significant problem for Shein on top of all the other issues it already faces.
And big thing for Shein, I guess, we've touched it upon a little bit here and there already. It's not just that it negatively affects their business right now, but the big dream they had was to go onto the stock exchange. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. That was a dream that first reached like the news outlets. I think, if I'm not mistaken, in November, I think it was November 23. And at first they had plans to enter the stock market in the US. They started working on this there. I think they even officially filed papers, but they faced a lot of backlash from American politicians that had concerns about Shein being a Chinese company, the ties of Shein with the Chinese government. There were concerns about them using cotton that was actually made with forced labor. So in the end, they decided to move away from the US and actually try it in London. That was happening around this time of year last year, so 2024. They reverted to London. And normally this is a process that lasts like 4 weeks, but it kept on going for months and months. They faced the same backlash. There were also many concerns about their human rights violations, the environmental impact, their ties with the Chinese government. After a long time of lobbying, which is also something we recently wrote about, their ties with like lobbying companies and how they actually used big names in their lobbying to make this happen. They received the go-ahead from the Financial Conduct Authority in London, but then their own securities regulatory commission got in the way, and supposedly they didn't get approval from their Chinese government to go to the stock market in London. And now they are trying to go for a listing in Hong Kong. So they tried US, failed, tried London, failed, and now they're going to Hong Kong.
Do we have any idea why the Chinese regulator didn't allow them to enter the stock exchange in London?
It's very unclear. There's not that much messaging around it yet. Alex, do you know? Do you know more?
I think it's safe to suggest geopolitics plays a role in a sense. So for Shein to be listed in London would have been a win for the London stock market, which hasn't seen a lot of big listings in the last couple of years. It would have also been seen as a way for the company to legitimize itself in front of European, American, kind of broadly Western investors. In a sense, the company is interestingly, Shein doesn't really sell its products in China itself. So it sells elsewhere in the world. And I think the company is at least formally based in Singapore. But so the question is, where is this company really at? Where is the center of its gravity? And I think the idea was to bring it to the West. If that is not happening, that could have any number of meanings for the company itself, but also for the Chinese economy it exists in today. So maybe one can only speculate, but maybe the idea for the Chinese government was to say, well, we have this national champion. We're not going to, let it raise investments in the West and be a Western company. So we want to keep it a Chinese company and rather have it listed in our own biggest stock market in Hong Kong.
And can we still call it a national champion? Or is Shein's glory already something that's all in the past?
I think it will manage to go to Hong Kong, as like the backlash was mainly coming from like European politicians, European consumers, consumer protection groups, NGOs, and so on. So I can imagine that it would be easier in Hong Kong and they will succeed there.
Now moving back to something that we were talking about before, this on-demand model, and Shein makes all these big claims about their model, that it's such a successful operation. And one of the big claims they also make is that it makes their fashion a lot more sustainable. How do you look at that, Yara?
Yeah, this is an argument they use a lot. This is also something that I investigated in my first story of Shein, because this was one of their big claims, their big sustainability claim. Like, we are an innovative company. We don't produce more than we actually sell. So there's no excess inventory that gets trashed somewhere. But the first point I want to make here is that is obviously not the only environmental concern that big fashion companies have. So there's also the point of the materials they use. Shein uses its products basically only on polyester, which is a fossil-based material. So there's a big environmental impact there. Then there's the point that the products of Shein are very, very low quality. So there's many companies in Europe, the companies that are actually sorting the clothes after consumers throw them away, that are complaining about the fact that there are so many Shein products coming in that are so low quality that they cannot basically resell anymore. So after like 1 or 2 wears, these clothes, they basically just fall apart. Consumers throw them away. And we don't really have a system for bringing these products back into the loop. So what happens is that they often get shipped away. We know from colleagues of us in another like investigative outlet that found out that many of these products actually get shipped, for example, to Chile, where they end up in the desert on these big dumps where they just leak into the environment. So there's many different environmental concerns that Shein is actually contributing to. So the fact that they're always relying on this on-demand model in saying that they are sustainable is already a hoax, in my opinion. But then there's also the fact that I actually found out that this on-demand model is not really that sustainable even, because what happens is that they basically push the production to production partners. They work with factories that are partners, but that are not integrated into the company. That means that when Shein has an order, they just send a signal to their production partners and they say, okay, we want this product to be produced and we need it in 2 days. These partners have expressed on Chinese media that it's very difficult for them to actually produce it within 2 days. So what they start doing is already produce beforehand, so that they can actually meet the demands of Shein. So the overproduction gets pushed there, because if they guess that they will have an order for a specific item, but they won't get that order in the end, they have this overproduction that Shein claims not to have. And I found so many videos online on TikTok where there's resellers in, for example, Vietnam and Philippines getting sent these big bulks of overstock of Shein items that are basically just floating the markets there. So the argument that they don't have this overproduction and are therefore sustainable, it's not true.
It's a toxic business model, however much the company claims the opposite. You look at Shein and you think, how can this be in any sense be touted as an innovative new business? They're reselling a dated fast fashion model that has already been seen as obsolete in many parts of the world.
True. What is really interesting is that the other fashion companies like Zara and H&M are basically succeeding in setting themselves apart from Shein. So we talked about how Shein is very different from H&M and Zara. And I think in many ways it is true. They work differently, and Shein is claiming that as an advantage. They are doing better with this on-demand model. And Zara and H&M are saying, no, they are worse than we are. And what we are seeing now is that actually European governments are following the arguments of the European companies such as H&M and Zara. So recently, the French Senate passed a fast fashion law. And when it was passed to the lower house in France, it was still a law that would basically slow down all fast fashion companies. So it would harm Shein, it would harm Temu, but it would also harm H&M and Zara. So the proposal was that, for example, if you produce products with materials that were not so sustainable, you would need to pay a tax for this. So the prices of these products would increase. And also there would be a ban on advertising for fast fashion. What passed through the Senate, the upper house, is actually a very different proposal in which only Shein and Temu get targeted. So only the ultra fast fashion companies get targeted. And now there's like this debate ongoing. Okay, there has to be a debate between the Senate and the Assembly, so the upper house and the lower house. Which proposal are we gonna basically go with in the end? So it's interesting to see that the other companies are actually maybe profiting from the fact that we are all saying these business models are so different.
Yeah, because it sounds to me like there used to be these bad guys, say H&M and Zara, but then a worse guy came into the room and now the French government is like, maybe those other companies aren't so bad anymore. But it's not like they got better in reality, right? It's just like there's a worse player now.
Yeah, you could say that. And I think that's really interesting to see that there was a proposal to actually make the fashion industry a bit more sustainable. And now, the only thing what will happen is that these huge new players get pushed out, and the others can continue doing what they were doing already.
Alex, do you know anything else about what the European Commission is doing in this regard?
So the enforcement of the Digital Services Act is very much a black box. It's very hard to track from the outside. What I am hearing from sources is that the work on Shein is very much ongoing and they're still looking into it. It was just 4 months ago that the last request for information went out, and I think information has been received from Shein. So what I think is now is now bound to happen is that there will be some kind of action, so announcement of a formal investigation or not. But I think it is highly plausible that the Commission will take some kind of action.
But as you said earlier in this episode, knowing the European Commission probably will not be next week and not next month either. It will probably still take quite a while, right?
It is not for mere mortals such as me to know.
All right. And that's where we'll leave it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Yara, and Alexander and I will be back soon for another episode. You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.